Hey guys, Miss Owing here. Welcome to today's video on nonviolent resistance. In this video, we're going to talk about three things: civil disobedience, the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and the Montgomery bus boycott. Let's start with civil disobedience. So civil disobedience is sort of the main ideology of Martin Luther King, who I am sure you have heard of already, but just to refresh you, he is one of the civil rights leaders, the main guy of the movement. And he believed in nonviolence, meaning if the government was to pass a law that was unjust or unfair, then people had the right to oppose it using nonviolent ways. So, for example, using things like marches and boycotts, picketing, and other demonstrations, right? Think of people in the streets with signs marching forward. I think sometimes people look at nonviolent resistance and nonviolent protest strategies as nice but not effective, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists throughout the 50s and 60s got real change to happen through nonviolent actions. And I wanted to share this quote from Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. He says, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." And this is a really important quote because it shows his reasoning for not just letting oppressive things, illegal things, immoral things happen, right? We know that things are not just going to get better. White people are not suddenly going to give up power and give rights back to Black Americans. That has to be demanded, and it has to be public. One of the most well-known public demonstrations for equality is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And this was a protest in 1964 that was led by Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders to advocate for equality, for civil rights, for good paying jobs, to end police brutality, for so many things that were affecting Black Americans at the time. This is also where Martin Luther King gives his historic "I Have a Dream" speech. And at this march, over 250,000 people joined Dr. King and joined other civil rights groups in this large public demonstration. I want to shout out a guy who I bet nobody here has heard of, and I really think that you should. This is Bayard Rustin, and he's a civil rights activist who was a lead organizer of the March on Washington and did also a number of other demonstrations and protests and other actions to help advance the cause of civil rights. And one of the reasons why you don't know who he is, why he's not often taught, is that he was often in the background. He was behind the scenes, behind the curtain, so to say. And Rustin was a gay man, an openly gay man, and this was used against him in order to limit his visibility in the movement. He was doing his work, but he was doing so off camera. Let's take a moment to analyze this political cartoon about the March on Washington. On Edpuzzle, a question is going to pop up and ask you to write your response here. So keep in mind, when we're looking at images of any kind, we're going to ask ourselves, what do we see? Meaning, what looks important? What stands out to you? And then, what do you think this could mean? What is the artist here trying to tell us? Let's finish up by talking about the Montgomery bus boycott. This was an epic protest where Black people all across Montgomery, Alabama, refused to ride the city bus, refused to pay the fares in the city bus in order to protest the bus's policy of racial segregation, meaning having separate spaces on a bus for white and Black passengers. And so this is an example of a boycott where people refuse to use a service or to buy a product to send a message to the company. So what caused this boycott to take place? Well, the Montgomery bus boycott was an effect of Rosa Parks' action, refusing to give up her bus seat to a white passenger when she was asked to. Now, we've talked about Rosa Parks before in class. I know you've heard the lore in previous years too, but keep in mind, Parks is not just a tired old lady who didn't want to give up her seat. She was an activist, and she was deliberately planning this bit of action with the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was a key civil rights organization at the time. And together they planned this action, which would cause people to look at what was happening in Montgomery, look at the segregation happening on buses, and take a stand to end it. And the amazing thing was, it worked. The Montgomery bus boycott worked. People, Black Americans, for almost a whole year boycotted the buses, refused to ride city transport, and the city was poorer for it, right? They weren't collecting those fares. And this photograph is amazing. You see Black Americans walking to work together, refusing to pay the bus fare for a system that wasn't including them. And the Supreme Court ended up deciding this issue, and they said that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. It was against the law. And so this action, this boycott, made up of ordinary people deciding not to pay for the bus every day, collectively were able to create change at a huge level, at the level of the Supreme Court, and which of course ruled that segregation was not legal on buses any longer. I want to finish this video highlighting a civil rights leader you probably never heard of, and that is Claudette Colvin. And Claudette Colvin has an amazing story that's going to sound quite a lot like someone else we've looked at today. At age 15, she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus. And this is exactly, of course, what Rosa Parks would do about a year later. And we don't know Claudette Colvin's story. I think we should know that a 15-year-old without any coaching, without any agenda, made the same decision as someone quite a lot older with the NAACP's support. And we don't know her story because, well, probably for a lot of reasons. But first off, she was a kid. She was 15. And sometimes young people are not taken as seriously as they should. She was also darker skinned than Rosa Parks. She was young and she was pregnant at the time. And so the leadership of the civil rights movement didn't look at her as this icon that she could have been. And I think it's an interesting thing to look at, the story not told, what might have been if Claudette Colvin, her story had been out there. Would we know her name just like we know Rosa Parks' name? Would she be one of the few civil rights leaders that almost everybody in the country could name? That is it for today's video, guys. Thank y'all so much for watching and for your attention. I'll see you next time.